Coral reefs are more resilient than we give them credit for. On this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast, we are going to be talking about how scientists have learned that coral reefs can actually recover faster than we originally thought. This is the How to Protect the Ocean podcast, your weekday ocean news update. If you are interested in staying informed on the ocean each and every weekday, hit that follow button right now so you don't miss tomorrow's story. So here's what the research shows. There are a number of different sources that we have today, and it is phenomenal. We have a 20-year history, long-running data from Jamaica, Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and other Caribbean reef locations. We also have a story on nature, climate change, and how the Great Barrier Reef, reefs in the Coral Triangle, and other Indo Pacific reef system have recovered even with climate change, and how that will change over that time. And then we have a couple of studies with NOAA Coral Reef Watch, on the recovery of that, and looking at science information from U.S. Pacific reefs like Hawaii and other Pacific islands, U.S. Caribbean reefs, and reefs in U.S. jurisdictions in Florida and Puerto Rico. So lots of data on looking at it. But what it really shows is that we have long-term data monitoring everything that lets you actually measure the recovery over decades. The Indo-Pacific reef shows broader patterns that link local management and heat stress recovery to recovery success. And NOAA's work ties it all together with global heat stress tracking and management framework that applies to many reefs sites. So let's just get into it. When a coral reef in these days, in this day and age in 2026, when it hits a problem. Coral reefs have a very narrow range of parameters. So pH has to be like around 8.3, 8.4. The temperature has to be within a certain range, anywhere from I believe it was 25 degrees or 22 degrees to, maximum of maybe 27, 28 degrees. Anything above that, it could go through heat stress. Maybe my ranges are a little off there. There has to be good fish communities, like herbivorous fish. There have to be enough coral eating fish. There have to be enough cleaners within that state, within the reef, invertebrates that clean the fish from parasites and everything, that will help support coral recovery. Okay, we also notice that reduced fishing pressure increases recovery rates. Surprise, surprise. And that lower pollution improves resilience. Again, surprise, surprise. Stable temperature conditions will actually enhance survival. Are all these surprises? No, but unfortunately, in a lot of these places, this isn't what's going on. We aren't lowering the pollution. We're actually increasing the pollution. We're not making the temperature stable. We're actually increasing the temperature, and it's fluctuating varying degrees depending on where you live on the planet. We're not oftentimes reducing fishing pressure. We're actually increasing fishing pressure. So these are all different cases that we have to realize will help in the recovery of coral reefs. So the NOAA studies notice that monitoring enables rapid response to bleaching events. So the more that we're watching, the better that it is, right? The better that we can actually act, the faster we can act. Adaptive management improves long-term outcomes. This is a complex term, although I know what a lot of people think. Adaptive management, you adapt to the management strategies that you put forth, which is exactly what it is. But unfortunately, when we put management plans together, a lot of times it's just followed directly as we go through. What adaptive management does for coral reefs or for any kind of marine monitoring program or management program is that when you start looking at your initial, say it's a marine protected area or initial coral reef that you're monitoring, you look at that coral reef and you assess it every maybe 3 years, every 5 years, every 10 years, or you go every 2 years, right? And then you can absolutely tell when things are going awry or when things are actually doing well, or how that long-term data shows the natural variation or the response to human influence pressures like climate change, fishing, and pollution. And so when you have these long-term data and you start to see something happening, just like I said, just like the study said before, when you're monitoring often, you can go into recovery mode and action mode a lot faster. And so when you start doing that, for instance, on the Great Barrier Reef, every once in a while you get these starfish that come in and they're an invasive species and they eat all the coral. And when I say starfish, it's not just one or two. You get millions of starfish over the Great Barrier Reef and parts of the Great Barrier Reef, and that can seriously affect the health of that coral reef? Well, if you're monitoring it carefully and you're monitoring it often, you will find out that there are ways to go in and just pluck them out. You can just go in by hand and pluck them out and have people go in and have a rapid response team to go in and help those corals out and make sure that doesn't spread over more, because the more that these starfish eat, the more they're actually going to grow in population size, and they're going to cover more area as they come in. So having that adaptive and being able to say, hey, one thing we have to do is, we have to adapt to the original management strategy of, hey, we didn't know that these species came in these areas. Now we have to go back and we have to say, hey, let's go and make sure that we incorporate this and we start to do early detection of these starfish. How do we do that? Through technology, drones, people who ecotourism boats that are often there. This is something that we always want to know. So if you're finding this information valuable and you haven't followed us yet, this is your reminder. So new ocean updates drop every weekday morning at 5 a.m. Eastern. So don't lose out. Hit that follow button right now. So when we talk about recovery, here's what helps. So when you have strong enforced MPAs, reduced nutrient runoff, sustainable fisheries management, and community-led stewardship and climate change mitigation efforts, we start to see recovery happen faster. When you have MPAs are designed, they do not have a physical boundary. They have this imaginary boundary around a specific area. That's an important area to coral reefs. It might be a spot where coral reefs are very diverse. It might be a spot where they are receiving coral larvae from another spot and is coming into this area by currents, and it's settling in this coral reef. That might be an important, what we call it, a coral recruitment area. And that's an important spot. It's called, really, when we look at it from an ecological perspective, like as a manager, like that's a biological sink. So that means there's larvae coming in and settling in this area, and it's very important. So if you allow fishing in this area, where you can get hooks that get caught on corals, or you get fish that are taken away often, those corals are left vulnerable, but it's a sink, and they're continuing to get the stuff, but the corals can't build, and there's nothing that's going to be settled. And eventually nothing's going to be settled there because the corals are going to disappear. This would be a prime spot for a marine protected area. Right. And so when you have this marine protected area, you can't have fishing. There's certain things that you can't, anything extractive. So fishing, mining, fisheries where you're actually like grabbing like abalone or some kind of snail or anything like that. You can't have any extractive processes that happen within there, or activities that happen within that marine protected area. What it does, it allows natural things to occur. You can't stop marine pollution because pollution will come in. You can't stop climate change from, rearing its ugly head, but you can stop extractive or any kind of human beings in that area that could harm the corals, like scuba divers or snorkelers. Not that they do it on purpose, but they can go in and they can hit the coral, and then it can it could break off and it could damage the corals and things like that over time. That doesn't always happen. So, you can have these little options that will help. So the marine protected area will help. I mentioned that marine protected areas can't help marine pollution from coming in, but you can do that along the coastline. You can have better measurements for nutrient runoff. As I mentioned in yesterday's episode, nutrients in coral reefs don't do well. Nutrients allow for the propagation and the growth of algae. So when you have algae that grows on corals, the corals can't take them off unless there's a fish that will eat algae or an invertebrate that will eat algae off the coral. But that doesn't always happen, especially if you're fishing within that. So having that reduced runoff from the coastline that we can easily manage and better manage, that is a better thing to allow for that recovery to happen. When you have sustainable fisheries management, that's just it's really easy to really think about what happens. You are fishing properly, you're not overfishing. And, a lot of the times artisanal fishers are not necessarily overfishing, maybe not on purpose. Maybe they need some guidance. Maybe they need some collaboration with other people. There are a lot of organizations that go into communities like villages and so forth where there's a lot of artisanal fishing, and they work with the community to be like, how can we help in any kind of way? Sometimes, communities will be fishing juvenile fish and not realize it's juvenile fish, because reef fish, when they're juveniles, they look very, very different than their adult form. They actually metamorphosize into a different color pattern and even different look. And so some fisheries don't realize that. Some artisanal fishers don't realize that, and over time it's the only thing that's available because maybe they've overfished another species. Not that they're doing it on purpose by any means, but when you have scientists go in and work collaboratively with the communities, if they're invited in, that makes sustainable fishing a lot easier in a lot of these ecologically diverse places like coral reefs. And of course, community-led stewardship goes hand in hand with working with local communities, making sure that the community is on board, making sure that they're leading the fact that they want to have sustainable fisheries. They want to have a reef that's diverse. They want to have protection from that reef that I talked about yesterday. When you have an intact reef, a structurally complex reef, you can actually get storm protection, like storm surge protection, which is really great. And of course, climate change, that's just something that we need to mitigate on a global level. And we need to help a lot of these small island communities, a lot of these global south communities that may not have or may not be contributing to the greenhouse gas effect, just like other countries, developed countries are doing, like Canada, US, and other places around the world. So, climate mitigation needs to happen on a global level, much better than what we've seen recently out of the US. Unfortunately, the US have basically said that CO2 is not a pollutant, and a lot of the efforts and policies that are going to happen are being taken away momentarily through executive order. Hopefully that will happen. That will become better as we get a new administration in, or even hopefully the midterms will change that, and we protect our environment better, we protect our people better. The whole point of this episode is that reefs can recover faster when protections are real and stressors decline. When you leave a reef by itself and allow it to manage itself without having any fishing pressures, any pollution, any climate change pressures, you will actually have an intact reef and a much better structurally complex reef, a much healthier reef, and that will actually recover a lot faster than if you continue the stressors like cumulative stressors like pollution and fisheries and all that kind of stuff. This will actually help. So if you enjoyed that, follow the show now so you don't miss tomorrow's episode update. I am looking forward to talking about marine protected areas more. So hit that follow button and tune in tomorrow. And until then, I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.